Other than investing in high-quality stocks, what is the best advice you can provide ordinary investors to minimize the negative effects of inflation? Charlie Munger says that if you're not perplexed by what's happening, you're not paying attention. Recent years have seen the worst levels of inflation in generations. The effects have been disastrous, and it is now estimated that a startling 61% of Americans are severely struggling financially as a result of the high inflation. There is, nevertheless, optimism that the current spike in inflation is only a passing phenomenon, with very low levels of inflation expected to recover somewhat quickly. Renowned financier before his death, Charlie Munger disagreed and raised concerns about the economy and inflation. In this video, we'll discuss why Charlie Munger thought inflation would persist, and perhaps most importantly, how to protect your finances from the damaging effects of high inflation. However, first, listen to Charlie as he explains how we got into this mess in the first place. Anything that comes to your attention now might not be on the minds of others because, well, nobody knows how much money printing we can do. Of course, there are politicians on both sides of the aisle who would prefer to believe. There is a point at which it becomes dangerous. And of course, my attitude when something is big and dangerous is to stay a long way away from it. Other people want to come as close as possible without going in. That's too tricky for me. I don't like it. That doesn't matter how much you do. We can ignore the whole subject and just print money as convenient. Well, that's how the Roman Empire behaved, and it was ruined. That's how the Wart Republic was ruined in June 2022. Inflation reached a peak of 99.1%, surpassing levels not seen in decades over the previous few years. To locate a period of time when inflation was this high, you needed to go back around 40 years to the early 1980s. As Charlie noted in an interview, money printing is a major contributing factor to the sky-high inflation. The United States money supply since 1960. The money supply in the U.S. was growing at an ever-increasing rate until 2020, when the U.S. Federal Reserve took truly unprecedented measures in addition to drastic measures by the government to prevent a widespread financial collapse. The money supply is exactly what it sounds like, a measure of all the readily available money floating around in the economy. In earlier interviews, trillions of new dollars were printed to bolster the economy. Charlie Munger likened the massive amount of money printing to someone using illegal drugs. While it may seem amazing at first, there are very serious long-term effects on the economy, one of which is inflation, to borrow the words of renowned economist Milton Friedman. Although the idea of inflation may seem complex, it occurs when there is an excessive amount of money chasing an insufficient amount of goods. I promise you, it's not difficult at all to see inflation in action. This idea of supply and demand will be used. In this context, it denotes the desire for a specific goods or service. For illustration purposes, let's say we're discussing a house for sale in your community. Thus, in this instance, the demand here indicates the quantity of individuals wishing to buy this residence, which is significant. You'll understand why in a moment. Here we have the supply, and the demand shows how much those purchasers are willing and able to spend on the purchase. The point where the supply and demand lines cross indicates the current pricing for that specific commodity or service. The supply shows the number of residences available in the area to be purchased. So in this example, the price of a house is determined by the Federal Reserve's Fed historically low interest rates, which made it much more affordable for individuals and businesses to borrow money to make purchases. As we discussed earlier in 2020 and 2021, the U.S. government and Federal Reserve took drastic measures to attempt to protect the economy. These measures included boosting unemployment benefits, sending cash directly to households, and pausing required payments on certain types of debt. Not only were there more potential purchasers in the market as a result of all of these activities, but the demand for residences also increased. Because of the low mortgage rates and the booming economy, these buyers were also able to afford to pay more for a home. However, the impact of these circumstances extended beyond the demand side of the equation. Supply chain problems made it more difficult and expensive to build new homes, and a lack of supply means that our supply line is pushed to the left at a higher price. This is how inflation operates. Too many dollars are chasing too few goods, or, to put it another way, demand exceeds supply. I've spent hundreds of hours studying the lives of Munger and other great investors, and I've compiled all of that research into the 3 biggest things we can learn from Munger on how to get rich during inflation. If Munger is right and higher inflation is here to stay, what can we do to protect ourselves financially from the potentially devastating effects of inflation? Fortunately, we can look to Charlie's legendary career for insights. All I ask in exchange is that you hit the subscribe button, because my goal is to improve your investing skills by studying the greatest investors in history. Now let's look at the list. The Mungers own apartments, Berkshire stock, Chinese stock, Costco stock, and a small amount of Daily Journal stock. Do I think that's perfect? No. Do I think it's okay? Yes. I think the great lesson from the Mungers is that you don't need all this damn diversification. That's plenty. And that you're lucky if you have 4 good assets. I believe that finance professors promote the idea that professional investment requires perfect diversification. You're lucky if you have 4 things to buy and can ask for 20 if you're attempting to go better than average. Very few people possess the intelligence to make 20 wise investments. Understanding the idea of what is called your quote real return is crucial to comprehending why inflation is detrimental to investors. When investing, your true return is the amount that, after accounting for inflation, your investment produced for you. This is known as the scaled nominal return, which is simply a fancy way of saying the return before the impact of inflation. Whether or not the average stock market investor is able to generate an 8% return before inflation is largely dependent on the inflation rate. This is the point at which real return becomes relevant. For the purposes of this example, let's assume that the inflation rate is 6%. The shorthand method of computing real return is to take the nominal return, in this case 8%, and deduct the inflation rate. After deducting the 6% inflation rate from our 8% nominal return, we are left with a 2% nominal return. Somewhat less remarkable than the nominal return of 8%. To illustrate what I mean, one strategy to reduce the effect of inflation on your real returns is to produce returns that are higher than average. To give you an example, let me introduce you to John. Assume John is able to provide a nominal return of 12%, but the stock market as a whole only returned 8%. Initially, let us assume that inflation is at 2%. Note that John's real return of 10% is a whopping 67% higher than the average stock market real return of 6%. This indicates that John generated a real return of 10%, and the stock market as a whole had a real return of 6%, again calculated by subtracting the inflation rate from the nominal or non-inflation adjusted return. Incredibly striking. But wait till you witness how this becomes amplified during a period of high inflation. Assuming that inflation has increased from 2% to 6%, John's actual return would now be 6%, while the real return on the average stock market would drop to 2%. It is evident that John's real return is not 67% more than that of the stock market as a whole. As we can see, it is higher by a factor of 3. Charlie Munger noted that producing higher than average investment returns becomes increasingly crucial as inflation rises. In that clip, having a concentrated portfolio made up entirely of your finest investments is one of the best strategies to achieve returns that are higher than average. Charlie Munger was a billionaire because his whole investment portfolio was made up of only a small number of stocks: Berkshire Hathaway, Costco, money from the Daily Journal Corporation that was managed by his protege Lou, and lastly a collection of Southern California apartment buildings. The conventional thinking in investing would claim that this is not appropriately diversified, although Charlie often used to say this. Next, Charlie Munger advises focusing on asset-light enterprises when investing amid inflation. If I were to follow the precepts of conventional finance, I would have a lot less money. Watch Charlie explain what he means. Businesses that fit into 2 categories can be identified if they are good but not exceptional. One is the company where all of the reported profit simply sits in surplus cash at the end of the year. You may remove this money from the company, and it will still function as well as it would if it remained there. The company that reports 12% on capital is the second one. However, there is never any cash. This reminds me of my old friend John Anderson's used construction equipment business. He used to say, In my business, every year you make a profit and there it is sitting in the yard. There are a lot of businesses like that where the only thing keeping them alive is cash. Since the business doesn't allow headquarters to extract large sums of money and invest them elsewhere, we detest that kind of operation. In this context, an asset is simply a fancy way of saying physical objects that a business needs to function. Consider it as a spectrum. On the one side are firms that are considered to be asset light, and on the other are businesses that require a varying number of assets to run, and the cost of those assets varies depending on the industry. These are companies that require very few, if any, physical items to run their day-to-day operations. An example of a company on this end of the spectrum would be an accounting firm. In an accounting firm, there aren't many expensive assets that must be bought because nothing tangible is being sold or manufactured. Additionally, there aren't any expenses related to inventory or expensive equipment that must be bought. Essentially, all that is required to run the business is to rent office space, purchase furniture, and purchase basic technology like computers. On the other end of the spectrum, there are businesses that are referred to as asset-heavy, which are the exact opposite of asset-light businesses in that they require a large number of physical assets to operate. An airline is one instance of an asset-heavy business. Aircraft are plainly necessary for airline operations, and they are not inexpensive. A brand new Boeing 737 plane would cost an incredible $106 million. As a result, asset-heavy businesses are more vulnerable to inflation since they must continually make larger and larger financial commitments. Replacing the vast array of physical assets required to run their business was precisely the problem that Charlie Munger's friend in the equipment rental business faced every year. As the story goes, Charlie's friend would work hard in his business, and when he looked up from his desk, he would see his usual profit sitting out in his equipment rental yard. This means that, because the equipment rental business is asset-heavy, any profit that Charlie's friend made had to be reinvested in the business to keep it operating. Now contrast that with an asset-light business. In an asset-light business, physical assets are not required to be continuously replaced at ever-increasing prices during inflation. Charlie Munger discusses the advantages of these asset-light businesses, particularly in inflation-generating times. Gaining wealth during inflation requires concentrating on asset-light enterprises and achieving high investment returns through a concentrated portfolio. But Charlie Munger claims that they are both insignificant compared to his next piece of advice. Having few unnecessary needs in life is an excellent way to guard against worrying about inflation. In other words, if you haven't created a lot of false desire to drown and purchase products, why you have a strong protection against life's adversities. Allow me to illustrate what Charlie means with a brief story. Become acquainted with Michael and John. John and Michael both reside in the same neighborhood and earn the same amount of money. For the purposes of this example, let's assume that John's monthly income is $6,000 and that his expenses are $3,000 each month. This means that John has an extra $3,000 per month to save and invest, which is determined by deducting his monthly expenses from his monthly income. Charlie, however, stated that Michael did not heed his advice. Michael's monthly spending reached $5,000. He has many, quote, ridiculous material needs in his life. Michael can save and invest the $1,000 that he has left over each month, while both John and Michael are doing well. Let's look at what happens when inflation occurs. Expenses rise, which is one of the main reasons inflation is so bad for most people's finances. But frequently, a person's income increases at a slower rate than inflation. To illustrate this, let's take John and Michael. Assume, for example, that inflation raises their expenses by 10%, but their incomes remain unchanged. Even if Michael's monthly expenses are $5,000 and John's are $3,300, they are both still able to make ends meet. However, Michael is getting very close right now. Assuming that inflation persists, John's monthly expenses will rise by 20% from their initial level to $3,600. This is exactly what Charlie Munger meant when he suggested that living beyond your means is the best defense against inflation. Michael's monthly spending have increased to $6,000. Ouch! Michael is in danger since his income is now barely meeting his monthly expenses due to inflation. What the future of inflation holds is something that can only be determined with time. In conclusion, Charlie Munger's insights on navigating wealth accumulation during inflationary periods serve as a beacon for those seeking financial success. By strategically investing in businesses with durable competitive advantages and fostering a mindset of continuous learning, individuals can position themselves not just to survive, but to thrive in the face of economic challenges. Munger's timeless wisdom reminds us that amidst the complexities of finance, a blend of strategic thinking, resilience, and adaptability can be the keys to unlocking prosperity during times of inflation. As you embark on your financial journey, consider incorporating Munger's principles into your approach, and may they guide you towards a path of sustainable wealth creation in the ever-changing economic landscape. In the ever-changing dynamics of the financial world, Charlie Munger's wisdom serves as a compass, guiding us through the complexities of wealth building during inflation. Munger's emphasis on enduring competitive advantage and continuous learning underscores the importance of adaptability in the face of economic uncertainty. By staying informed, making informed investment decisions, and maintaining a resilient mindset, individuals can position themselves not merely as passive observers of inflationary challenges, but as active architects of their financial destinies. Munger's teachings remind us that, in the pursuit of wealth during inflation, a strategic combination of knowledge, patience, and a forward-thinking approach can lead to not just financial stability, but true prosperity. We hope you found this exploration of Charlie Munger's insights valuable. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and share it with others who might benefit from these wealth-building strategies. Feel free to comment below with your thoughts, questions, or topics you'd like us to cover in future videos. Thank you for joining us on this journey to financial empowerment, and remember, in the words of Charlie Munger, spend each day trying to be a little wiser than you were when you woke up.